The Gospel according to Luke, chapter 22, verses 35 to 46. And he said unto them, When I sent you without purse and scrip and shoes, lacked ye anything? And they said, Nothing. Then said he unto them, But now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment, and buy one. For I say unto you, that this that is written must yet be accomplished in me. And he was reckoned among the transgressors. For the things concerning me have an end. And they said, Lord, behold, here are 2 swords. And he said unto them, It is enough. And he came out, and went as he was wont to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples also followed him. And when he was at the place, he said unto them, Pray that ye enter not into temptation. And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose up from prayer, and was come to his disciples, he found them sleeping for sorrow. And said unto them, Why sleep ye? Rise and pray, lest ye enter into temptation. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. In today's reading from chapter 22 of Luke, we are witness to the poignant and mysterious so-called agony of Christ in the Garden of Gethsamane on the Mount of Olives following the Last Supper. Now, at the end of yesterday's reading, we were witness to Jesus saying to Peter in particular that he would indeed deny him 3 times before the cock crew. And it's following on from that, from yesterday, that we now have this last little segment in the Gospel of Luke at the end of the Last Supper, which harkens back, in fact, to the instructions that Jesus gave the 12 disciples when he sent them on their first mission. And this is all the way back in chapter 9 of Luke. And if we just look at the beginning of chapter 9, we have the following. Then he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all devils and to cure diseases. And he sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And he said unto them, Take nothing for your journey, neither staves nor scrip, neither bread, neither money, neither have 2 coats apiece, and so on. And we learned that they returned from that ministry. We don't know how long that lasted. It was probably several weeks, preaching the gospel. And here he's hearkening back to that, and he says to them, When I sent you without a bag and without money and without shoes, did you lack anything? And they said nothing, and the reason was they were welcomed in the different towns and villages. People were eager to hear this gospel. We should bear in mind that was a mission in Galilee that the disciples went upon. But Jesus now is looking forward in time, to a different reception for the gospel message. We've heard Jesus say on different occasions statements like, Before they hated you, they hated me. And in his prophecy on the Mount of Olives, he warned the disciples that they would be persecuted, they would be brought before synagogues and courts and so on. And what he's really saying here in verse 36 is that now you need to provision for yourselves. You need to have money, you need to have a traveling bag, because it won't be such a joyful reception that you receive. Now, he also mentions a sword, and this has created a lot of discussion, as one might imagine, because the message of the gospel is one of love and peace. Pretty much every commentator that I've read, and these are older commentators, I tend to read commentaries from, let's say, the 1700s up to about 1900, but they are almost unanimous, I would say, in seeing this mention of a sword as metaphorical. And I think he's really just using that for emphasis, because I think I take I lean the same way with these commentators. And we'll see in a moment when the disciples speak of two swords that there's sort of an agreement there. I think it's using it for emphasis that they are going to have to look after their own safety. This is going to be a time of persecution and of trial, and they're going to have to probably work together, evangelize together in pairs and such, just as they did actually on that first mission, but to really be aware that many people around them will not want to receive the message and may have their harm in mind. The sword is clearly not for protection of Jesus, because he, in verse 37, speaks of the prophecy in Isaiah, the famous prophecy in chapter 53, the so-called suffering servant. That is written must yet be accomplished in me, and he was reckoned among the transgressors. And that's a direct quote from Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 12. Let me just read that to you. This is within chapter 53, is very beautiful language. If I had more time, I would read it to you right now. It's so beautiful. But a very tragic description of this despised servant of God. But in verse 12 of chapter 53, therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he hath poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Speaking there of Jesus taking upon himself the sins of mankind in his death. And of course, as we know from other Gospels, and as we'll see in Luke, Jesus having a criminal's death on a cross between two thieves, in fact. But Jesus is resolute in the ending that is to come. The things concerning me have an end. His death is foreseen, is prophesied, is inexorable. Now, as we've seen, I think on most occasions the disciples tend not to pick up quickly on metaphor when Christ uses it. For example, when they were leaving, I think it was Gennesaret, heading back to the east coast of the Sea of Galilee before they made their way up to Caesarea Philippi. They had an exchange there with the Pharisees, who had demanded a sign, and Jesus said, it is a wicked and adulterous generation who seek a sign. And then in the boat, as they went across the Sea of Galilee, Jesus had said to the disciples, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. And the disciples thought that this was to do with the fact that they'd forgotten to bring bread on the voyage. And when they mentioned that they didn't have bread, Jesus was quite stern with them, that he was speaking of both the hypocrisy but also the desire for a sign, that being the leaven, this sort of agitating agent that will wreak havoc within the gospel message if it's allowed to take hold, because it displaces faith. And that's just one example of a metaphor the disciples missed beautifully. And I think, again, commentators feel that this is another beautifully missed metaphor here. They say to Jesus, behold, here are two swords. probably swords that they've had with them on their journey from Galilee. It would not be uncommon for travellers to have some form of defence, mainly for wild animals, but also to deter robbers, so-called bandits. Plenty of threats on the road in those days. And as one commentator pointed out, these would be Galilean fishermen's swords, no match for the military might of either Roman soldiers or the Sanhedrin guard. And he says to them, "It is enough," and this is seen again by commentators to be ironic, meaning it is enough of this conversation and it's time to leave. It is enough. Not 2 swords will be enough to defend me, because Jesus will not be defended and doesn't wish to be defended, because he knows that he must be the Paschal Lamb. So that section there, unique to Luke. In Mark and Matthew, after the rather stern words of Jesus to Peter that he would be denied, they arrive at Gethsemane. In fact, I'm just remembering in Mark and Matthew that exchange between Jesus and Peter happens en route to the Mount of Olives, and it's really after the blessing of the bread and the wine that they leave the Last Supper. So this episode in the upper chamber, unique to Luke. What's not covered by any 3 of the synoptic gospels are 4 entire chapters of the Gospel of John, chapters 14 to 17 of teaching, and of the beautiful prayer in chapter 17 of John, all of which occur after the Last Supper and before the capture of Jesus, and that's just absent from the synoptic gospels. But common to all 3 synoptic gospels is the so-called agony, or suffering, or trial in Gethsemane. Gethsemane, a garden on the Mount of Olives, literally meaning an olive press. So it's thought to have been a garden where perhaps there was work done processing olives in the season of olives. And as he was wont, we're told, so as was his habit, was to go to this place. And of course that's why Judas knows where to find him with the armed guard that will be coming in the next reading. Jesus makes his way there and his disciples follow him. Now, in my coverage of this episode in Mark and Matthew, I speak of the events here having a decidedly supernatural character, and that supernatural character originating from the presence of supreme evil in this place, namely the presence of Satan. I don't have a different view on that than I had back in the spring with Mark or the summer with Matthew. And I'll try to make that case again in today's commentary. I don't read this in other commentaries, I have to say. They don't have that view, although I must say in the pulpit commentary there was mention of perhaps some supernatural agency at work, causing the disciples to sleep, which they do, as we'll see, which is otherwise really hard to understand. So just also to say, this is very briefly covered in Luke, and in fact Bengal, who is not typically I would say critical of others or critical of the Gospels at all, but he has some rather sharp words regarding this. In fact, no, actually, it's not Bengal, it's Maya. That's why. So Maya is quite critical of others' interpretations or of certain elements of the Gospel. This is Heinrich Maya, who I've not lent on too much as a commentator, but he's very well regarded commentator from the 1800s, who was very, very expert in ancient Greek, also in other languages, and was forensic in his analysis of the language used. But he has this to say about this passage in Luke, that Luke disturbs the cleanness of the narrative and mixes it with legendary elements, namely verses 43 and 44, as we'll see shortly. Just to bear that in mind, because there are two verses here that appear only in Luke, and Maya describes them as legendary elements. They come to the garden, to the gate of the garden, and Jesus says to the disciples, "Pray that ye enter not into temptation." Now, in the longer description of this in Mark and Matthew, it's only the inner core, Peter and the brothers James and John, that go further with Jesus. The other 8 stay there at the gate. Now, that division of the 11 into 8 and 3 is not described here in Luke. And let's just think about what Jesus says here. Pray that ye enter not into temptation. Interesting. Let's bear that in mind as we go, and then I'll make this case for the presence of Satan once we've gone through the verses here. Now Jesus walks from them about a stone's cast, a little further, so 20 or 30 yards, and kneels down and prays. And I think it's in the description in Matthew where we have a slightly more, I would say, dynamic description of that. So he takes Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and if I just read on from verse 37 in Matthew chapter 26, "And began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Then saith he unto them, My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here and watch with me. And he went a little further and fell on his face and prayed." And that, I think, it's basically a different narrative, isn't it? Kneel down and prayed sounds so demure. But in Matthew, Jesus is in an agony of suffering. My soul is exceeding sorrowful unto death. He is in the deepest possible anguish. And he throws himself on the floor and prays with his entire being to his Father. "Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." And that's a similar prayer that we read in Mark and Matthew. Completely obedient to the Father, but saying to the Father, if there's any other way, take this destiny from me. But it's not what I wish for, it's what you require that must be done. So completely steadfast, but seeking in this last moment before capture a possible reprieve from something. And commentators all agree, and I agree with them, that this is not concerning the wretched, awful, hideous nature of his earthly death. It's much more than that. It is the necessity for this divine being who was without sin to essentially wallow in the sins of mankind, to absorb, as it were, the sin of mankind, or to bear that sin on his shoulders, to go from being totally clean to being totally filthy. And I think this is the revulsion from a lifetime without sin. Now these are the legendary elements, so-called, in the next 2 verses, and indeed in a number of early manuscripts, verses 43 and 44 are absent in the Gospel of Luke. They appear in other relatively early manuscripts. They are regarded as being bona fide, but people don't really know what to make of them. Maya certainly sees them as gratuitously added. So in 43 we learn that an angel appears to give him strength, to minister to him. And again, in regard to the case that I'm trying to make in terms of the presence of Satan, let's just remember that the last time an angel appeared at the side of Jesus was after his trials in the wilderness. After he'd been baptized, Jesus went to the wilderness for 40 days fasting and had the 3 temptations of Satan. After those temptations, an angel ministered to him. Being in an agony, and this is not agony of physical pain. This is translated by the Cambridge commentator from the Greek as an intense struggle. Being in an intense struggle, continues praying. And we learn here that the sweat was falling from him like great, and the Greek here would be clots, great clots of blood, not drops, but like strings of clotted blood, his sweat falling down to the ground. And you can see this is in a very, very different style to what we see in Mark and Matthew. And a key element that's missing here in Luke, and again, it's hard to quite fathom sometimes with Luke. I don't want to come across as being an arch critic of the Gospel of Luke, but it is noteworthy that there are key omissions in Luke, or key conciseness in Luke in important sections of the Gospel. And Mark and Matthew make a great description here of the fact that Jesus returns to the disciples 3 times, and each time he returns he finds them asleep. And indeed, if we look at the Gospel of Matthew again, in fact it's the Gospel of Mark I want to refer to. If we look at this in Mark in chapter 14, there is a very key point here. When he comes back the second time and finds the disciples asleep, we read, neither wist they what to answer him. They didn't know what to answer him when he comes and finds them asleep again. And we even learn their eyes were heavy. And this record from Mark would be essentially from Peter himself, who would have been one of those disciples who was indeed asleep. And his memory of this night is that he didn't understand why he was asleep. His eyelids were heavy and had nothing to explain himself to Jesus. And the point I made when I covered these events in detail in Mark and Matthew is that there is no normal, natural explanation for the disciples to fall asleep. Yes, it's late at night. Yes, Jesus may have been praying for an hour or more. But these were healthy young men. They were fishermen. They were used to fishing all night. They're used to the night. They're used to being up for 24 hours or more. They love Jesus Christ with all their heart. They've left everything to be with him. They know things are coming to a crisis. They know that one of them has betrayed Jesus. They're expecting trouble at any time. Their master is in an anguish greater than they've ever witnessed. They are not going to fall asleep through natural agency. I think that idea is preposterous. But all 3 Gospels agree that they did fall asleep. Luke here says he found them sleeping for sorrow. But the words that Jesus left them with was to pray. Pray that you enter not into temptation. So what I see occurring here is that this agony in Gethsamane was a final temptation of Christ from the devil. In particular, it's in the Gospel of Luke itself where, when we read of the temptations of Christ after the baptism, the devil doesn't just leave Christ. Satan, in verse 13 of chapter 4 of Luke, we have, and when the devil had ended all the temptation, he departed from him for a season. Not for good, but for a season, waiting in the wings. And here is the perfect time to strike. The disciples are mortal men. Their prayers were in vain, and they have been tempted through the agency of the devil to sleep. leaving Jesus more vulnerable. He's completely alone in that garden. And that agony of Christ, asking that question to his Father, even though he knows the answer, it's a rhetorical question ultimately. But there's two things that any person or any creature would do in this situation. In the discipline of ecology, they have this phrase, fight or flight. So when an animal is cornered, it can either run or it can fight or flight. So Jesus could either have flight, he and his disciples could keep walking to Bethany, keep walking to Samaria, keep walking to Galilee. They would all live. They could still preach the gospel, but they would be free of the Sanhedrin, they would be free of the Roman force in Jerusalem, and it would be a different trajectory. However, Isaiah's prophecy would not be fulfilled. Alternatively, they could fight, and by fight I don't mean with those two Galilean fishermen's swords, but Jesus, with his divine power, could simply show everyone a celestial sign. They would bow down before him, and he would finally do the thing that he has absolutely not done throughout his ministry, claim the empty chair of the King of David and reign in Jerusalem and become an earthly king forever, surrounded by slaves. And again, unfulfilled prophecy, unfulfilled gospel. The gospel would become a superficial. It would be like a propaganda banner within a totalitarian state. So we have to understand that for this divine being, the two obvious things are not options, and he has to actually do nothing. This is why it's so difficult. Neither flee nor claim his natural authority. He has to do nothing. He has to, it's the hardest thing to do sometimes, it's nothing. He has to allow himself to be taken captive. He has to allow himself to be abused. He has to allow himself to be the victim of calumny and lies, and allow himself to be scourged and crucified and mocked with doing nothing in return. That's an agony. So it's 3 times that he comes back to find them asleep. In a way, he has 3 periods of temptation, therefore, just as he had 3 temptations in the wilderness from Satan. So I think that there is within this a very natural, I called it 2 bookends when I spoke of this in the Gospel of Matthew commentary. This agony in Gethsamane is like a bookend to the beginning of his ministry, which was indeed the retreating to the wilderness and having the temptations of Satan. And he has resisted on both occasions. And he's standing by his disciples, shaking his head, waking them up, knowing that at hand is the armed guard of the Sanhedrin with the son of perdition, Judas Iscariot, at their head. And that will be the subject of tomorrow's reading.